Aurelius Hawk. Valerius did not believe in coincidences anymore. He had lived too long for that. He had seen the fall of the Roman Empire, watched the ink dry on the Magna Carta, and pulled his brothers from the freezing mud of the Somme in 1916. Fate, he had learned, was not a wheel that turned by chance. It was a weapon wielded by the patient. And nothing tested patience quite like the phone ringing at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that smelled of rain, ozone, and ancient, unresolved regret. The sound was an intrusion, a violent vibration against the mahogany surface of his workbench in the penthouse sanctuary. Hawk was elbow-deep in the restoration of a 16th-century clock mechanism, his pale, steady hands manipulating gears that hadn't turned since the Renaissance. He moved with the stillness of a predator, a being who had long ago forgotten how to breathe simply out of habit. In the absolute silence of his fortress, where the air was filtered and the windows were triple-paned against the city noise, the buzzing phone sounded like a scream. When it buzzed again, spinning like an angry hornet across the wood, Hawk's movement froze. The caller ID glowing in the dark room made his unbeating heart drop into his stomach with the phantom weight of a tombstone. Arabella County Public Defender's Office. He hadn't heard from anyone in that area code in 3 years. Not since Gabriel's funeral. Not since he had stood in the pouring rain, hidden beneath a black umbrella to shield his skin from the gray daylight, and made a blood oath over a flag-draped coffin. He remembered the sensation of a 19-year-old girl's hand, warm, fragile, trembling, squeezing his icy fingers so hard he thought his marble-like bones might crack. She had looked up at him with Gabriel's defiant green eyes, eyes that haunted his dreams during the daylight sleep, filled with a grief so raw it felt like a physical blow. Hawk wiped the delicate clock oil from his hands onto a velvet rag, his movements blurring with supernatural speed. He picked up the phone, his grip threatening to crush the device. "This is Valerius," he answered, his voice rough as gravel and carrying the faint, unplaceable accent of a dozen forgotten languages. "Mr. Daniels," he added quickly, slipping into the mortal alias he had maintained for this specific decade. The woman's voice on the other end was young, strained, professional, but cracking at the edges with the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a losing battle against a rigged system. "My name is Sarah Jenkins," she said, her breath hitching as if she had been running. "I'm a public defender in Arabella. I'm calling about Elena Russo." The name hit him like a physical blow, like a stake driven through the chest plate of his armor. Elena, the waitress, the student, the daughter of the only man who had ever made Hawk feel human in the last century. What happened? Hawk was already moving, the phone pressed to his ear as he strode through the dark corridors of his estate, passing portraits of eras long gone. "Is she hurt?" She is physically stable for the moment. "But Mr. Daniels, she's been arrested." "She is in the county lockup." Sarah paused, and Hawk's enhanced hearing picked up the sound of papers rustling nervously on the other side of the line. He heard the rapid, frantic beat of her heart, the scent of her fear transmitting over the connection. "We're looking at charges of aggravated assault and attempted murder." Hawk stopped dead in the center of his armory, a room lined with weapons ranging from medieval broadswords to modern tactical rifles. "Attempted murder?" "Elena puts spiders outside rather than killing them. She is a healer, not a killer." "Who is the victim?" "Sterling Thorne," Sarah whispered, the name dragging the air out of the room. "The son of District Judge Archibald Thorne." The silence that filled Hawk's room was colder than the grave. He knew the name. Thorne was a dynasty in that part of the country, a family that treated the law not as a set of rules, but as a private inheritance to be wielded against the weak. "She was in the alley behind the diner where she works," Sarah continued, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "Sterling cornered her after her shift. She fought back. But Mr. Daniels, the police report, it doesn't match the physical evidence. They're saying she lured him there. They're calling it a premeditated attack. And Elena, she gave us your name. She whispered it to me while they were fingerprinting her." Sarah's voice broke. She said, "You promised my father you would come if the shadows got too long." "I'm coming." Hawk was already scanning the rows of keys hanging in the glass cabinet. "Don't let anyone intimidate her. Don't let her sign a plea deal. Do you hear me? Nobody." "Mr. Daniels, you don't understand." Sarah interrupted, her voice trembling with the weight of the reality she was facing. "The arraignment isn't next week. It's tomorrow morning. At 9 a.m., Judge Thorne has assigned himself to the case. He intends to revoke bail and send her to the state penitentiary before lunch. Once she's in there, with the Thorne family's connections inside the prison system, she won't survive the night," Hawk finished for her, the realization settling over him like a shroud. "I don't care who he is," Hawk growled, his voice dropping to a register that caused the glass in the cabinet to vibrate ominously. "Gabriel Russo saved my existence in the trenches of Kandahar. He took a bullet meant for my heart. The last thing he asked before he died was for me to watch over his little girl. So I am asking you, Miss Jenkins, one more time. Can you keep her safe until I get there?" There was a long silence on the line. Then a whisper, barely audible. "How fast can you get here?" Hawk looked at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. He calculated the distance. 300 miles of desert highway, dawn approaching in 5 hours. He made a decision that would change everything. A decision that would threaten the masquerade his kind had upheld for centuries. "Give me until the court opens. And Miss Jenkins, thank you for calling me. Not everyone would have defied a Thorne." After he hung up, Hawk stood in the silence of his garage, surrounded by the skeletons of machines he had collected over the decades. His reflection stared back from a chrome mirror, 52 years old in appearance, face weathered like canyon rock, a scar running from his left eye to his jaw from an IED that should have killed him, but didn't, because Gabriel had thrown himself on top of Hawk instead. Hawk touched the scar. To the world, he was a wealthy recluse, a scarred veteran living off wise investments. To the night, he was the king of the Sanguine Covenant, a ruler of the shadows. He pulled out his encrypted phone and opened the secure channel for the order. 300 members spread across the tri-state area. These were not just friends. They were kin, brothers and sisters who had ridden through dust storms, revolutions, and the collapse of civilizations. They had shown up for funerals and weddings, for sieges and treaties. They understood that family wasn't always blood. Sometimes it was forged in fire and sealed with loyalty. Hawk's fingers hovered over the keyboard. This wasn't a social call. This wasn't a request for a diplomatic meeting. This was serious. This was the kind of thing that could bring the hunters out of the woodwork, the kind of trouble that followed vampires like shadows, the kind that made humans lock their doors and clutch their pearls, praying that the monsters in the stories weren't real. But then he remembered Elena at Gabriel's funeral, how she had looked so small in that black dress, standing alone in the rain, the last survivor of a good man. How she had whispered, "Uncle Hawk, will you still visit me?" And how he had promised, yes, even though her mother's new boyfriend, a cop with cold eyes, had steered her away before Hawk could say more. He started typing. "Elena needs us. Gabriel's daughter. Arabella Courthouse. Corrupt judge. Innocence betrayed. Wheels up at 4 a.m. This isn't optional. This is family." The responses came in like thunder, rolling across the digital network. "I'm in. Silas. Diesel. Count me there. Victor. Reaper for Gabriel. Marcus. Maven rolling out. Celine. Smoke. Elias." Within 10 minutes, all 300 members of the Covenant's inner circle had responded. Within 20 minutes, Hawk's phone was ringing with logistics. Questions about sunlight protection, offers of legal supplies, contacts in the Department of Justice, immortals rearranging their eternal lives because a brother had called and a promise needed keeping. Hawk looked at his garage one last time, at the half-finished restorations and the photos on the wall. One photo stood out. Him and Gabriel in their army days, young and stupid and invincible. Gabriel was grinning at the camera, arms slung around Hawk's shoulder, blissfully unaware that the man he was hugging was a monster who drank blood to survive. Gabriel had no idea that 10 years later he would bleed out in the Afghan sand, saving his best friend's life. "I'm coming, brother," Hawk whispered to the photo. "I got her." He grabbed his long coat, the heavy leather one with the Covenant sigil stitched subtly into the lining, a wolf devouring the moon with the words, "Loyal to the end" in Latin. He walked out into the pre-dawn darkness. His vehicle sat waiting, not a motorcycle, but a matte black armored sedan, modified for speed and sunlight protection, gleaming under the single garage light like a patient beast. As Hawk turned the ignition, the engine roared to life, echoing through the empty Arizona street like a warning shot. Somewhere in the cold cell of the Arabella jail, a waitress was lying on a metal cot, probably terrified, probably thinking no one was coming, probably thinking that a waitress didn't matter to the universe. She was wrong. 300 vampires were about to prove that some promises are kept, no matter the cost. The ride had begun. Dawn threatened to break over the desert like a wound, all red and gold and angry, forcing the convoy to move fast to beat the sun. But the Covenant was prepared. Their windows were tinted to illegality, their skin protected. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the highway leading to the small town of Arabella looked like a scene from an invasion movie, except this was real and the stakes were a young woman's life. 300 vehicles lined up in formation. 300 engines rumbling like distant thunder. 300 predators who dropped everything because family called. Hawk monitored the convoy from the lead car. He surveyed his crew through the rearview mirrors and the digital uplinks. There was Victor, known as Diesel to the mortals, a 6'4" mountain of a vampire who ran a successful demolition company and coached Little League on weekends, hiding his immense strength behind a gentle smile. Celine, Maven, a grandmotherly figure to the outside world who had actually survived the Inquisition and now wore her late human husband's dog tags as a sacred relic. Marcus, Reaper, who taught high school math when he wasn't enforcing the Covenant's laws or wearing his ceremonial robes. Elias, Smoke, a former Marine who had served 2 tours in Vietnam and now volunteered at veteran centers, using his immortality to heal those the system had forgotten. These weren't the monsters the movies made vampires out to be. These were mechanics and teachers, nurses and contractors, beings with mortgages and kids in college, adopted or stepchildren they loved fiercely. But they all wore their colors, black suits, crimson ties, leather coats, with pride, and they all understood that loyalty meant something. "Listen up," Hawk's voice cut through the encrypted radio channel, overriding the engine noise. The rumbling conversation died to a low purr. "We've got 300 miles behind us and the town limits ahead. We enter Arabella in 10 minutes. We park in the main lot. We walk tight. We walk smart. And we don't give any cops a reason to pull us over. Not yet. What's the play when we get there?" Victor's voice came over the comms. "We protect Elena, whatever that takes." Hawk paused, choosing his next words carefully. The beast inside him wanted to tear the courthouse down, but the king knew better. "But we do it right. No violence, no feeding, no threats. We're not giving anyone ammunition to paint us as the bad guys. The judge is the victim's father," Hawk reminded them. "He'll be looking for any excuse to have us arrested or exposed." Celine spoke up, her voice sharp despite her apparent age. "So, we're just going to stand around looking pretty while some badge-wearing bastard tries to send that girl to prison?" "No," Hawk said, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes, visible even in the rearview mirror. "We're going to stand our ground legally. I've already called Chains." A murmur rippled through the encrypted channel. Everyone knew Chains. Bartholomew Chains, Wellington. A former Covenant enforcer who traded his sword for a law degree 100 years ago, but never forgot where he came from. He was the best defense attorney in 3 states and had gotten more than a few Covenant members out of tight spots involving exposure risks. "Chains is meeting us at the courthouse. He's already pulling strings, filing paperwork. We're doing this by the book." Hawk's gaze swept across the horizon, where the steeple of the Arabella courthouse was becoming visible. "But make no mistake," Hawk growled. "That girl is not leaving that courtroom in handcuffs. Not while we're breathing." The channel roared with approval. As they prepared to enter the town, Hawk caught Marcus checking his tablet in the passenger seat, frowning. "What is it?" Hawk asked. "Just did some digging on the judge and his son," Marcus said quietly. "Sterling Thorne. Expelled from 2 universities. DUI charges that vanished. Assault charges dropped last year. He's a predator," Marcus concluded. "And his father, Judge Thorne? 15 years on the bench, community pillar, volunteers at church. Perfect cover," Hawk muttered, his jaw tightening. "There's more." Marcus's voice dropped lower. "Elena's mother, Gabriel's widow, died 8 months ago. Car accident. Single vehicle crash on a clear day, Marcus read from the report. The implication hung in the air like poison. Can you prove anything? Hawk asked. Not yet, but I've got friends in the archives. Give me a few hours. Hawk nodded grimly. This was worse than he'd thought. They weren't just dealing with a spoiled son. They were dealing with a system. They were dealing with someone who knew how to work the law, who understood evidence and procedures, who could make things, and people, disappear. Mount up, Hawk called out to the convoy. We're going in. The engines roared, a symphony of chrome and gasoline and defiance. Hawk took point, and the convoy fell in behind him, a river of leather and steel flowing out onto the main street of Arabella. As they hit the town square, Hawk felt the familiar meditation of the hunt settle over him. The sleepy storefronts blurred past. Behind him, his family rode in perfect formation, a statement of purpose that made locals stop on the sidewalk and stare. Shopkeepers flipped their signs to closed and locked their doors. Somewhere ahead, Elena was waiting. Somewhere ahead, a confrontation was brewing that would test everything they stood for. Hawk twisted the steering wheel, guiding the massive car toward the courthouse. He thought of Gabriel, of promises made and blood spilled. He thought of a little girl who'd grown up without her father and was now trapped with a monster wearing a judicial robe. The street stretched before them like a challenge, and the Sanguine Covenant answered. By the time they reached the courthouse square, the sun was fully up, but the tinted windows held the light at bay. The Arabella courthouse had never seen anything like it. The rumble started as a distant vibration, like an earthquake that wouldn't stop. Nurses at the clinic across the street paused. Diners in the cafe pressed their faces to the glass. Security guards at the courthouse entrance reached for their radios, uncertain whether to call for backup or just watch. Then they came around the corner. 300 black vehicles moving like a mechanical army, chrome flashing in the sun, engines creating a sound that rattled windows 3 floors up. Hawk led them into the parking lot with military precision. He didn't need to speak. The formation split, cars peeling off in organized rows, filling every available space, blocking the judge's reserved spot. Within 2 minutes, they were parked. Within 3, the engines cut off in unison, leaving behind a silence so sudden it felt violent. Then, 300 vampires dismounted and stood beside their machines, waiting. The courthouse's heavy oak doors stood looming, and Hawk walked toward them first, alone. His boots echoed on the concrete steps. Every eye in the square turned to watch. The massive man with the scarred face and the dark coat that seemed to swallow the light. Inside the lobby, behind the security scanner, a young deputy's hand hovered over his taser. "I'm here to see Elena Russo," Hawk said quietly, stopping before the metal detector. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of centuries. "My name is Aurelius Valerius. A public defender named Sarah Jenkins should be expecting me." The deputy swallowed hard, glanced at his monitor, then at the massive crowd of silent figures standing just outside the glass doors. I need to verify. Mr. Valerius." Everyone turned. Sarah Jenkins stood by the elevators, a briefcase clutched to her chest. She was younger than Hawk expected, maybe 28, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and exhaustion written across her face like a second skin. "Miss Jenkins?" Hawk crossed the lobby in 3 long strides. "Thank you for calling me." Sarah glanced past him at the parking lot, visible through the glass doors. An ocean of black cars and dark figures standing in silent formation. "You brought quite a few people," she whispered. "I brought family," Hawk replied. Hawk kept his voice low, meant only for her. "Where is she?" Sarah hesitated, then gestured toward the secure hallway. "Holding cell B. But Mr. Valerius, we need to talk first. There are complications." They rode the elevator up to the detention level in a silence that felt heavy enough to crush bone. The fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that grated on Hawk's sensitive hearing, a buzzing insectoid sound that smelled of ozone and cheap electricity. When the elevator doors slid open, Hawk stepped into a corridor that stank of industrial bleach and human misery. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies were stationed by the heavy steel door at the end of the hall. They were leaning against the wall, their posture lax, sharing a joke that died on their lips the moment they saw the tall figure in the black coat emerge from the lift. One of the deputies, a man with a thick neck and eyes that shifted too quickly, straightened up, his hand dropping instinctively to the taser on his belt. He squinted at Hawk, trying to process the sheer size of him, the unnatural stillness that radiated from his frame. "Restricted area," the deputy grunted, stepping forward to block the path. "No visitors. The judge signed the order himself this morning." Sarah Jenkins stepped forward, her voice trembling, but her chin held high. "I am her attorney of record, Deputy Miller, and this is a consultant for the defense. We have the right to see my client before the arraignment." The deputy sneered, looking Hawk up and down. "A consultant? He looks like an undertaker." Hawk didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He simply lowered his sunglasses a fraction of an inch, revealing eyes that were the color of a turbulent ocean, gray and churning with a storm that had been raging for centuries. He focused his will, a subtle push of the glamour that his kind used to cloud the minds of prey. "You will let us pass," Hawk said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Because if you don't, I will file a complaint that will have you guarding a parking lot in the desert for the rest of your career." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise delivered with the absolute certainty of a king. The deputy blinked, his eyes glazing over for a split second. The primal part of his brain, the part that remembered when humans were not at the top of the food chain, screamed at him to submit. "Make it quick," the deputy muttered, stepping aside and swiping his keycard. "5 minutes, that's all you get." Sarah led Hawk into a small, windowless consultation room and closed the door, leaning back against it, as if to hold back the tide of corruption outside. "Elena has a fractured wrist, a severe hematoma on her left cheek, and multiple lacerations on her forearms," Sarah said, the words spilling out in a rush. "The medical report at the jail says she sustained them resisting arrest and falling during the struggle. But Mr. Daniels, I saw the photos. The bruising patterns are consistent with fingertips," Sarah whispered, her face pale. "Someone grabbed her, hard, and the cuts on her arms, they are defensive wounds. She was shielding her face." Hawk's hands, resting on the back of a metal chair, tightened. The steel groaned, warping slightly under his grip. He released it instantly, smoothing the metal back into shape with a thumb, hoping Sarah hadn't noticed. "This wasn't a scuffle," Hawk said, his voice cold. "This was an assault, by a man who is used to taking what he wants." "Sterling Thorne," Sarah confirmed. "He is 25, a former college athlete who was expelled for conduct violations that were sealed by his father. He rules this town like a prince. He came into the diner last night drunk. When Elena refused to serve him, he waited for her in the alley." "Where were the witnesses?" Hawk asked. "The diner is on Main Street. Someone must have heard her scream." "Officer Morrison, no relation to the good ones, was the responding officer. He claims the alley was empty except for Elena attacking Sterling. He didn't interview the cook. He didn't check the security cameras from the bank across the street." Sarah's voice hardened with bitterness. "He brought her straight here. Judge Thorne was called at home. He issued the remand order at 3 a.m. They are trying to bury her before the sun fully rises." "But she told you the truth," Hawk said. "She whispered your name to me," Sarah said, meeting his gaze. "She was terrified, shaking so hard the handcuffs were rattling. She said, 'My father told me if the monsters ever came, I should call the King of Shadows.'" Sarah hesitated. "I don't know what she meant by that, Mr. Daniels. But when I looked outside and saw 300 men in black standing in silent vigil, I started to wonder if the monsters she was talking about were the ones in here, not the ones out there." "The problem is," Sarah continued, checking her watch, "Thorne is demanding her transfer. He wants her moved to the state penitentiary immediately after the arraignment. He says the county jail isn't secure enough for a violent offender." "Secure enough?" Hawk let out a dark, humorless laugh. "He wants her where his father's friends can reach her, where accidents happen in the showers." "You're telling me," Hawk said, beginning to pace the small room like a caged tiger, "that I rode 300 miles through the night, risking everything, and this judge thinks he can just sign a piece of paper and erase a human life, unless we can stop the arraignment?" "Yes." Sarah pulled out her phone, showing him a text message. "The prosecutor is already here. He just parked. Sterling Thorne is with him." Hawk stopped pacing. The beast inside him roared, demanding blood. demanding that he tear the door off its hinges and feast on the corrupt hearts of the men, destroying Gabriel's legacy. But the man, the part of him that Gabriel had saved, forced the beast back into its cage. "Can I see her?" he asked finally. Sarah nodded. "I bribed the guard to look the other way for 2 minutes, but we have to be fast." She led him through a second door into the holding block. It was darker here, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and hopelessness. Cell 412 was at the end of the row. The girl sitting on the narrow metal cot was almost unrecognizable from the child Hawk remembered at Gabriel's funeral. She had grown taller, her face thinner, etched with the hard lines of a life lived paycheck to paycheck. Her waitress uniform was torn at the shoulder, and her left arm was cradled against her chest in a makeshift sling. But those eyes, Gabriel's eyes, green, defiant, and currently filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Uncle Hawk!" Elena's voice cracked, disbelieving. She stood up, wincing as her ribs protested. She moved to the bars. "You actually came?" Hawk crossed the distance in a blur, stopping just inches from the iron bars. Iron was uncomfortable for his kind. It itched against his aura. But he ignored the discomfort. He couldn't touch her, not with the barriers between them, but he placed his hand against the air where hers would be. "I promised your dad, didn't I?" Hawk said, his voice thick with emotion. Then, the 22-year-old woman who had been trying to be strong, who had fought off a predator in an alley and faced down a corrupt police force, finally broke. The tears spilled over, tracking through the dirt and dried blood on her face. He didn't just try to hurt me, Hawk," she whispered, leaning her forehead against the cold bars. "He was laughing. He told me nobody would believe a waitress over a thorn. He said I was trash and that he was doing the town a favor. He said his father makes problems disappear," Elena choked out, "like the girl from the college last year, the one who overdosed in her dorm room." The words hit Hawk like bullets. "He killed her?" Hawk asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I think so, and he kept my locket, the one Dad gave me. He tore it off my neck and put it in his pocket like a trophy." Everything had just changed. Hawk barely had time to process the rage, to calculate the vengeance that would be visited upon the House of Thorn before Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "He's here," she whispered urgently. Sterling Thorne just walked into the booking area, and he brought the prosecutor and 2 more officers. Hawk looked at Elena. "Stay strong. Do not say a word to them. Do you understand?" "Not one word." "I'm scared, Hawk," she whispered. "You don't need to be," he said, and for a moment his eyes flashed with a hint of red, a glimpse of the king beneath the skin. "Because the monsters are on your side now." Hawk turned and stepped into the hallway. Through the reinforced security window overlooking the front entrance, he could see his crew. 300 vampires standing in the parking lot, patient as statues, a silent army of shadows in the morning light. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text to Victor. "Diesel, stay ready." The response was immediate. "The pack is hungry." When Hawk reached the main booking lobby, he understood why Sarah looked terrified. Sterling Thorne stood in the center of the room like he owned the building. He was a handsome man in a conventional, polished way. Square jaw, expensive haircut, perfectly pressed suit. But to Hawk's senses, he was rotting. He smelled of stale alcohol, fear, and the sour arrogance of a man who has never been told no. Beside him stood a man in a gray suit, Prosecutor Vance, holding a leather briefcase, flanked by 2 armed deputies who looked like they were ready for a riot. The station commander hovered uncertainly behind the desk, caught between the authority of the Thorne family and the menacing presence of the man in black who had just emerged from the cells. Thorne's confident smile didn't reach his eyes when he spotted Hawk. He paused, his survival instinct flaring. He sensed a predator, though he couldn't identify what kind. "Mr. Daniels," Prosecutor Vance said, his voice oily and projecting across the lobby. "I've heard about you. The family friend. I appreciate you checking on the defendant, but the state has this covered. This is a criminal matter." Hawk walked forward slowly. He moved with a predatory grace that made the deputies shift their hands to their holsters. Every step was a statement. "Elena asked for me. That makes it my business," Hawk said. "Elena is confused and violent. Sterling Thorne spoke up. His voice was smooth, reasonable, the voice of a politician in training. "She had a psychotic break. She attacked me unprovoked. I'm just here to ensure the community is safe. But I'm willing to be lenient," Thorne added, adjusting his silk tie. "If she pleads guilty to the assault, the court, might consider probation instead of prison, for her own good." "With a fractured wrist and defensive wounds on her arms?" Hawk asked, his voice level but carrying a dangerous edge. "That's one hell of an unprovoked attack." Vance stepped forward, trying to physically block Hawk from Thorne. "Mr. Daniels, unless you have legal standing in this matter, you need to step aside. My client, Mr. Thorne, is the victim here." "Funny thing about victims," Hawk said, stepping around Vance as if the man were a ghost. He stopped 2 feet from Sterling Thorne. "They usually don't keep trophies." Thorne's eyes widened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The locket," Hawk said softly. "The silver locket with the picture of a soldier inside. You took it from her neck." "That's a lie," Thorne snapped, but his hand twitched instinctively toward his jacket pocket. "She's a liar and a junkie. And now you show up with a gang?" Thorne gestured toward the glass doors, to the army outside. "A motorcycle club?" Hawk corrected with a dry smile. "A gang," Thorne insisted, his voice rising. "Trying to intimidate a court of law? I could have every single one of you arrested for harassment, domestic terrorism even." "You have no idea who you are dealing with," Thorne hissed, leaning in, lowering his voice so only Hawk could hear. "My father is the law here. I have friends in every precinct in the state. I've put away trash like you for looking at me wrong. You want to make this a fight?" Thorne's eyes were manic now. "I'll bury her, and I'll bury you and your leather-clad freak show." The air in the lobby grew thick. The deputies unclipped the retention straps on their holsters. The tension was a physical weight, a match waiting to be struck. Hawk felt the situation teetering on a knife's edge. If he snapped Thorne's neck now, which he could do before the deputies even drew their weapons, it would be over. But Elena would be lost. The covenant would be exposed. "We're not the ones who hurt her," Hawk said quietly, meeting Thorne's eyes. He let a sliver of the abyss show. "But I think you know that already." For a brief second, Thorne's mask slipped. Hawk saw pure panic flicker across his face, the realization that money and influence meant nothing to the creature standing in front of him. Then the automatic doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss. "Did somebody order a shark?" The voice cut through the tension like a blade. Everyone turned. A man in an immaculate 3-piece charcoal suit strode through the entrance. He carried a briefcase that looked like it cost more than the police station, and his silver hair was styled with geometric precision. Bartholomew Chains. Wellington had arrived. Behind him, visible through the glass doors, the 300 vampires had moved. They had left their cars and formed a silent, solid wall on the courthouse steps. They weren't just standing there anymore. They were watching. "Actually," Chains said, smiling a smile that showed too many teeth, "I believe the phrase is, 'Did somebody order a lawyer?'" He crossed the lobby, ignoring the stunned silence, and set his briefcase down on the booking desk next to the terrified sergeant. "Although," Chains continued, turning to Prosecutor Vance, "in this specific venue, the distinction between a shark and a lawyer is often academic." He extended a hand to Hawk. "Thomas, it has been too long." Then he turned to Sterling Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, I presume. I am Marcus Wellington. I will be representing Mr. Valerius and Miss Russo. And," Chains added, checking his pocket watch, "I suggest you call your father, because the legal battle you are about to face will make the sinking of the Titanic look like a minor boating accident." The arrival of Bartholomew Chains Wellington was not merely an entrance, it was a shift in the gravitational pull of the room. He didn't walk. He glided, commanding space with the ease of a creature who had walked the halls of Versailles before the Revolution. Every eye in the sterile, fluorescent-lit lobby tracked him as he crossed to Hawk, set down his ancient leather briefcase with a decisive click, and extended a hand that was cold as marble but strong as industrial steel. "Thomas," Chains said, his voice a smooth baritone that had argued cases before The Hague and the Courts of Kings, "it has been too long. Though I see your taste in dramatic entrances hasn't dulled with the centuries." Then he turned to Sterling Thorne and Prosecutor Vance with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that was all teeth and predatory calculation. "Mr. Thorne, I presume," Chains said, looking at the young man as one might look at a stain on a silk shirt. "And Mr. Vance, I am Marcus Wellington, attorney at law. I'll be representing Mr. Valerius and Miss Elena Russo in this matter." Sterling Thorne's arrogance faltered. He looked at the impeccably dressed man, then at the wall of silent, dark figures visible through the glass doors. The sight of 300 men in black standing in perfect stillness was unnerving, a visual representation of a power he couldn't bully. "This is highly irregular," Vance spluttered, stepping forward to block Chain's path, his face flushing a blotchy red. "The defendant has been assigned a public defender. You can't just barge in here. The arraignment is in 5 minutes." "Does she?" Chains asked, arching a silver eyebrow. He opened his briefcase, the smell of old parchment, expensive ink, and history wafting out. "Because I have here a signed affidavit of counsel, time-stamped 3 minutes ago by Miss Russo herself, granting me full power of attorney." He pulled out a document, crisp and terrifyingly official. "I also have a petition for change of venue and a motion for immediate recusal of Judge Archibald Thorne," Chains continued, his voice carrying the weight of courtrooms won and lost over 500 years. "On what grounds?" Vance demanded, snatching the paper. "On the grounds of familial conflict of interest, malicious prosecution, and credible allegations of conspiracy," Chains said calmly. "We have reason to believe the presiding judge cannot remain impartial when the alleged victim is his own son. Even in a town this quaint, nepotism has its limits." "That's preposterous," Sterling Thorne shouted, his carefully cultivated mask slipping to reveal the petulant child beneath. "My father is a respected jurist. He is the law in this county." "Your father is a compromised man," Chains corrected, checking his vintage pocket watch, a Breguet from 1790. "I've already contacted the state Supreme Court. Justice Herrera has agreed to an emergency oversight hearing via video conference." He looked at Vance with eyes that seemed to strip the prosecutor's soul bare. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Until then, any attempt to move Miss Russo, coerce a plea, or bring her before Judge Thorne will be considered a violation of a pending federal order." The lobby erupted in murmurs. The deputies looked at each other, hands hovering over their belts, uncertain. The power dynamic had flipped in seconds. The immovable object of the Thorne dynasty had just met the irresistible force of the Sanguine Covenant. "You can't do this," Vance hissed, sweat beading on his forehead. "We run this county." "I can, and I did," Chains replied, his voice hard as iron. Vance scanned the document rapidly, his hands shaking slightly. His expression darkened as he realized the paperwork was flawless. "This is a delay tactic," he accused. "This is due process," Chains corrected gently. "Something you, as an officer of the court, should appreciate." That was when Hawk noticed the change in the light outside. Flashes, not sunlight, but camera strobes. News vans were pulling into the parking lot. First 1, then 3, then a dozen. Cameramen were spilling out, running toward the courthouse steps, drawn by the impossible sight of 300 luxury cars and a legion of men in black standing in silent vigil. Sterling Thorne saw them too. His jaw clenched. "You called the press," he accused Hawk. "I didn't have to," Hawk said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the chaos outside. Chains gestured toward the windows where reporters were already filming the silent wall of the Covenant. 300 vampires, concerned citizens, descending on a small-town courthouse. That's news, Mr. Thorne. That is a spectacle. The question is, what story do you want told?" As if on cue, a reporter and a cameraman pushed through the revolving doors, microphone already extended like a weapon. "Mr. Thorne! Mr. Vance!" the reporter shouted, thrusting the mic into the space between them. "Can you comment on the allegations that the judge's son assaulted a local waitress?" Sterling Thorne held up his hand, instantly shifting into public relations mode, a skill he had undoubtedly learned from his father's campaigns. "This is a private legal matter," he said, his voice smooth, reasonable, dripping with false sincerity. "It is being exploited by outside agitators with no standing in this community." "Ah, my family is the victim here," Thorne continued, playing the role of the wounded party to perfection. I was attacked, and now a gang has shown up to intimidate a court of law. Look at them. They are threatening the sanctity of justice. Is it true the girl specifically asked for Thomas Valerius? Another reporter called out, shoving through the growing crowd. Why would she call a stranger if she was just a violent criminal? Thorne's composure cracked for just a second. Hawk saw it, the flash of panic in his eyes. He knew that if the narrative slipped away from him, his father's protection wouldn't be enough. Chains leaned close to Hawk, his lips barely moving. We need to get ahead of this. You should make a statement. I'm not good with cameras, Hawk muttered. I belong in the shadows. Exposure is death. You don't need to be good. You need to be honest. Chains straightened Hawk's collar, dusting off an imaginary speck of dust. Tell them why you're here. Make it personal. Make it real. Don't use the V word, but let them feel the loyalty. The humans crave a savior, Thomas. Give them one. Hawk looked through the glass at his crew standing like sentinels. At Silas, who stood immovable as a mountain. At Celine, who watched the door with lethal focus. At Marcus, who had abandoned his classroom to stand in the sun. They had all come because he had asked. Because a promise meant something in a world where everything else died. He walked outside. The cameras pivoted toward him like hunting dogs catching a scent. Microphones thrust forward. Questions overlapped into a wall of noise. Hawk held up one hand. He didn't shout, but he projected his will, a subtle push of dominance, the voice of the king that silenced the crowd instantly. My name is Aurelius Valerius, he began, his voice rough but steady, carrying across the silence without a megaphone. 20 years ago, I served in a different kind of war with Gabriel Russo, Elena's father. He saved my life. He took a bullet meant for me. Before he died, he asked me to watch over his daughter if the darkness ever came for her. Hawk paused, allowing the emotion to tighten his throat. Genuine emotion, for the memory of Gabriel was the one human thing he held on to. 3 years ago, I made that promise at his funeral. Last night, that little girl called for help. Are you accusing the judge's son of abuse? A reporter shouted from the back. I'm saying a daughter asked for help, and I came, Hawk said, his gaze sweeping across the lenses, daring them to look away. That is all. We are not here to fight. We are not here to cause trouble, Hawk lied smoothly. They were absolutely there to burn the world down if needed. We are here because family matters, because promises matter, because sometimes a child's voice gets lost in the noise of a corrupt system and somebody needs to make sure it's heard. Behind him, the 300 members of the Covenant stood motionless, a unified statement of purpose. The reporters ate it up, already typing headlines on their phones. Promise kept. Began to trend before Hawk had even finished speaking. Inside the lobby, Sterling Thorne watched through the glass, his expression unreadable. But Hawk's enhanced vision caught the minute details. The vein throbbing in Thorne's temple, the way he pulled out his phone with trembling hands to make a call. His body language screamed urgency. Whatever Thorne was planning, he was accelerating the timeline. Chains appeared at Hawk's elbow as the cameras flashed. That was perfect, the lawyer murmured. Social media is already exploding. The narrative is shifting. Good, Hawk said, his eyes never leaving Thorne's figure inside. Because I have a feeling Thorne is about to make his move. He's calling his father. Then we prepare for the siege, Chains said. By noon, the Arabella courthouse had transformed into a fortress of wills. The Covenant set up a perimeter in the parking lot. It wasn't just a blockade, it was an occupation. They brought out folding chairs, coolers filled with synthetic blood packs disguised as energy drinks, and secure satellite uplinks. They weren't leaving. Celine organized the perimeter watch. Silas coordinated the physical security. Marcus, the Reaper, disappeared into a quiet corner of the lobby with his laptop, hacking into the county's encrypted servers, digging deeper into the Thorne family legacy. Inside, Chains commandeered a corner of the courthouse cafeteria. He spread documents across 3 tables like a general planning a war, ignoring the terrified looks of the lunch ladies who had never seen a suit that cost more than the cafeteria's annual budget. Hawk sat across from him, nursing a black coffee he wouldn't drink, while Chains explained the battlefield. Thorne is playing this smart, Chains said, highlighting sections of legal text with a red pen that looked like a bloodstain. He's filed a counter motion claiming you run a criminal organization. He's citing your lack of a digital footprint prior to 1990. I like my privacy, Hawk grunted. The court calls it suspicious, Chains countered. He's painting you as a dangerous cult leader attempting to subvert justice. He wants to frame this as a moral panic to get the public on his side. He is claiming the Covenant has known gang affiliations, Chains read. He is creating reasonable doubt about your intentions while positioning himself and his son as the defenders of traditional values against the invading horde. Hawk felt his frustration rising. The beast wanted to tear the building down brick by brick. So, what do? We prove he's lying, Chains said, pulling out another document. And we prove that this isn't the first time the Thorne family has used the law as a weapon. This is where it gets interesting, Chains tapped the paper. I pulled the judge's financials, public record for elected officials, but Marcus found something else. In the past 2 years, Judge Thorne has liquidated 3 investment accounts and transferred nearly $200,000 to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Why would a small-town judge need that kind of liquidity? Hawk asked. That's the question, Chains smiled, showing a hint of fang. Either he's planning to run, or he's paying someone off, or covering something up, Hawk added. He remembered Elena's words. He makes problems disappear. We need to find out who else he silenced, Hawk said. If there's money moving, there's a trail. And if there's a trail, there are bodies. As they spoke, a knock on the cafeteria doorframe made them both look up. Standing there was a young man in a wrinkled shirt, clutching a manila envelope to his chest. It wasn't Sarah Jenkins. It was the court clerk Hawk had intimidated earlier at the metal detector. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, his eyes darting nervously toward the deputies in the hall. I heard what you said outside, the clerk whispered, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. About promises, about voices getting lost. He slid the envelope onto the table. If anyone asks, I was never here. I don't want to lose my pension, or my life. Hawk opened the folder. Inside were not legal briefs, but photos, crime scene photos, and a sealed autopsy report. This was last year, the clerk whispered. Another assault on Sterling Thorne, a college student named Maya. She died in police custody. The official report said suicide, drug overdose. But look at her arms, the clerk pointed with a shaking finger. Hawk looked. The bruises were identical to Elena's, the fingertip marks, the defensive wounds. She was fighting him off, Hawk said, his voice dropping to a growl. And when she threatened to talk, they killed her. The judge sealed the file, the clerk said. He threatened the coroner, but I made a copy before it was locked away. I couldn't let it happen again. Chains was already photographing every page with his phone. This changes everything. If we can prove a pattern of systemic abuse and cover-ups involving the judge's son, we can argue Elena is in immediate mortal danger. Can we use this? Hawk asked. It's stolen evidence. In the court of public opinion? Chains smirked. It's dynamite, and for tomorrow's hearing with Justice Herrera, it's a nuclear bomb. There's something else, the clerk added, checking over his shoulder. Judge Thorne just arrived. He came in through the back entrance. He's furious. He's calling for an emergency session right now, ignoring the recusal motion. He's going to try to force the arraignment through before tomorrow morning, Chains realized, gathering the documents. He knows we're closing in, Hawk said. He's panicked. Get some rest, Thomas, Chains said, standing up. Tonight is going to be long. Thorne will come with everything he has. Character witnesses, corrupt cops, probably half the town council. Let him, Hawk said, his voice hard as iron. We've got the truth. Truth doesn't always win in court, Chains warned. But it's a damn good start, Hawk replied. Outside, the first stars appeared over the parking lot where 300 vampires kept watch, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Inside, a 22-year-old waitress slept fitfully in a cell, guarded by monsters who had become her only hope. And somewhere in the night, Judge Archibald Thorne made phone calls to people who owed him favors, desperate to keep his empire of lies from crumbling. The morning would bring revelation, but the night belonged to the Covenant. The night had deepened, turning the Arabella County Courthouse into a monolith of stone and shadow against the ink-black sky. To the casual observer, the building should have been dormant, its halls silent until the machinery of justice ground back to life at 9 a.m. But to Aurelius Hawk Valerius, whose senses were tuned to the heartbeat of the world, the building was screaming. Inside, the air was thick with panic and conspiracy. Judge Archibald Thorne had not waited for morning. Terrified by the arrival of the Covenant and the looming intervention of the state Supreme Court, he had convened an emergency security hearing in the dead of night. It was a desperate maneuver, a kangaroo court designed to process Elena Russo, label her a flight risk and a danger to the community, and ship her off to the impenetrable depths of the state penitentiary before the sun and Justice Herrera could rise. The courtroom doors were barred, the blinds were drawn, the gallery was empty, save for 3 uniformed deputies handpicked for their loyalty to the Thorne dynasty, and a handful of court staff who looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Hawk stood outside the double mahogany doors of Courtroom 1. He could hear the proceedings inside, the frantic scratching of the stenographer's machine, the drone of Prosecutor Vance's voice, and the muffled sobs of a girl who realized the walls were closing in. Beside him, Bartholomew Chains Wellington checked his pocket watch. "This is illegal on at least 12 different levels," Chains noted, his voice calm, but his eyes burning with cold fury. "Ex parte communication, denial of public access, violation of due process." "He is trying to beat the clock. He thinks a locked door can stop us," Hawk said. "It is a sturdy door," Chains observed. "Solid oak, reinforced." Hawk didn't answer. He simply placed his hand against the wood. He didn't push, he didn't strike. He simply applied the crushing pressure of a creature that could bend steel beams like paper clips. The wood groaned, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet hallway, and the lock mechanism shattered with a metallic crack. Hawk kicked the doors open. They slammed against the interior walls with a violence that shook the dust from the ceiling beams. "Objection!" Hawk roared, his voice filling the cavernous room. The scene inside froze. Judge Archibald Thorne sat on the bench, a man of 60 with a face like a bulldog and eyes that held the wet, frantic shine of a cornered rat. He was not wearing his full robes, just a dress shirt and the judicial gown thrown hastily over his shoulders. Sterling Thorne sat at the prosecution table, smirking at Elena, who was shackled to the defense table, looking small and defeated in an orange jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too big. Prosecutor Vance was mid-sentence, holding a stack of papers that were undoubtedly the transfer orders. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Thorne bellowed, banging his gavel. "Bailiff, arrest these men! This is a closed session!" The 3 deputies reached for their weapons, but they froze when Hawk stepped fully into the light. He removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were no longer gray, but a swirling, abyssal black. He didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like a natural disaster wearing a suit. "You don't have enough bullets," Hawk said softly. Chains glided past Hawk, ignoring the guns pointed at his chest, and approached the bench. He moved with the arrogance of a predator who knows he is the most dangerous thing in the room. "Your Honor," Chains said, his voice dripping with mock respect. "I apologize for the interruption, but it seems my client, Miss Russo, forgot to invite her counsel to this midnight masquerade." "Mr. Wellington," Judge Thorne spat the name, "you have no standing here. I have already ruled that Miss Russo is a danger to the public. She attacked my son. She is being remanded to state custody immediately for her own protection." "Protection?" Chains slammed his briefcase onto the defense table. "Is that what we are calling it now? Sending a witness to a prison where 3 of your former business partners currently work as guards?" "That is a baseless accusation," Vance shouted, jumping up. "Your Honor, I move to have Mr. Wellington held in contempt." "I move to have you disbarred," Chains shot back. "But we can handle that later." He turned to Elena. "Are you all right?" "They made me sign papers," she whispered, tears streaming down her bruised face. "They said if I didn't, they would hurt you. They said you were a criminal." "Lies," Hawk said, moving to stand behind her chair. His presence was a shield. The deputies lowered their weapons slightly, unnerved by the sheer size of him and the way the shadows seemed to cling to his coat. "This hearing is over," Judge Thorne announced, signing the document in front of him with a shaking hand. "The order is signed. Deputies, take the prisoner. If you touch her," Hawk said, "you will lose the hand." The threat was so specific, so calm, that the deputies hesitated. "Do your jobs," Sterling Thorne screamed, standing up. "He's just one man. Shoot him." "One man?" Chains laughed dryly. He pointed to the laptop sitting closed on the court clerk's desk. "Open it." The clerk, the same terrified young man who had given them the file earlier, looked at the judge, then at Hawk. He opened the laptop. "Connect it to the main screen," Chains commanded. The clerk obeyed. On the large monitor above the jury box, a video feed sprang to life. It showed the exterior of the courthouse. 300 vampires stood in the parking lot. But they weren't just standing anymore. They had lit flares, red road flares that cast the scene in a hellish crimson glow. They stood in perfect formation, a legion of the damned, their faces turned toward the third-floor window of the courtroom. "That is not a gang, Your Honor," Chains said. "That is a witness list. And I have new evidence," Chains continued, pulling the stolen file from his briefcase. Evidence that was conveniently omitted from the prosecutor's discovery. "This is inadmissible," Vance shrieked. "You can't introduce evidence after a ruling." "I can when it proves the ruling was purchased," Chains said. He held up the autopsy photos of Maya, the previous victim. Maya Stevenson, age 19, died in police custody 11 months ago. Cause of death, overdose. "But look at the bruising, Your Honor. Look at the defensive wounds." Chains walked to the jury box and held the photo up for the empty seats, then turned it toward the judge. "They match Elena's injuries exactly. The fingertip marks, the shattered wrist, the pattern of a man who likes to break things that refuse to break for him." Judge Thorne's face went white. Sterling Thorne looked like he was about to vomit. "This is a fabrication," Sterling yelled. "I never met that girl." "Liar," a voice said. It wasn't Chains. It wasn't Hawk. It was Elena. She stood up, her shackles rattling. She looked at Sterling with a hatred that burned hotter than the sun. "You kept her ring," Elena said. "You told me in the alley. You said, 'You'll end up just like Maya, just another junkie with a cheap ring.' You bragged about it." "She's lying," Sterling screamed. "She's crazy." "Sit down, Miss Russo," Judge Thorne ordered, his voice cracking. "One more word and I will gag you." "She will speak," Hawk said. Hawk stepped away from Elena and walked toward the bench. The deputies raised their guns again. "Stop right there," the lead deputy shouted. "Back away from the bench." Hawk ignored him. He walked until he was standing directly in front of the judge's elevated podium. He looked up at the man who thought he was a god in this small town. "You think you are the law," Hawk said, his voice low, intimate, terrifying. "You think because you wear a robe and sit in a high chair, you are untouchable. You think your secrets are buried deep. I am holding you in contempt," Judge Thorne shrieked, slamming his gavel down so hard the handle splintered. "Bailiff, shoot him! I order you to shoot him!" The deputies hesitated. They looked at the screen, at the army outside. They looked at the monster in the suit. "You want to know what I am?" Hawk asked. He leaned in, his hands resting on the front of the bench. He lowered his voice so that only the judge, Sterling, and the deputies could hear. But the silence in the room was so profound that his words carried like thunder. "I am the thing that was old when this courthouse was just a drawing on a napkin," Hawk whispered. "I am the memory of justice that you have forgotten. And I know about the money, Archibald." The judge froze. "I know about the Cayman accounts," Hawk continued, his eyes boring into the judge's soul. "I know about the transfers you made 3 days after Maya died. $200,000 to silence a coroner. I know you liquidated your wife's pension to pay off the witnesses. And I know," Hawk said, his voice dropping to a hiss that sounded like a serpent striking, "that you are afraid. You aren't afraid of the law. You aren't afraid of the voters. You are afraid of him." Hawk pointed a finger at Sterling without looking at him. "You are afraid of your own son, because you created a monster and you don't know how to stop him." The judge's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The air seemed to have been sucked out of his lungs. "You have 2 choices," Hawk said, straightening up and addressing the entire room. "Option 1, you finish this farce, you send her to prison, and when you walk out of this building, my family will be waiting, and there is no law in this world or the next that will save you from what comes after. Option 2, Hawk said. You recuse yourself. You grant bail. And you pray that the state Supreme Court gets here before the devil does. The silence that followed was absolute. Sterling Thorne broke it. He lunged across the table, grabbing the deputy's gun. "He's bluffing!" Sterling screamed, his sanity snapping. "I'll kill them all!" Hawk moved. He didn't run. He simply ceased to be in one spot and appeared in another. He covered the 20 feet between the bench and the prosecution table in the blink of an eye. Before Sterling could raise the weapon, Hawk's hand was wrapped around the barrel. He squeezed. The metal of the gun crunched. The slide bent inward, rendering the weapon useless. Sterling pulled the trigger, but nothing happened except the sound of metal grinding on metal. Hawk backhanded Sterling, a casual slap that sent the young man flying across the room. He crashed into the jury box, wood splintering under the impact, and slumped to the floor, unconscious. The deputies stood frozen, their guns hanging uselessly at their sides. They had just watched a man crush a pistol with one hand. Hawk turned back to the judge. "Your son just attempted to murder a defense consultant in open court," Hawk said calmly, wiping a speck of gun oil from his glove. "I believe that is grounds for a mistrial." Judge Thorne stared at his unconscious son, then at Hawk. The fight went out of him. He slumped in his chair, a deflated balloon of a man. "Bail is granted," the judge whispered, his voice barely audible. "Recusal. Approved. Get him out of here. Get them all out of here." "One more thing," Chains said, stepping forward with a smile. "We will be taking the court recordings for safekeeping." Chains grabbed the stenographer's tape and the clerk's hard drive. Hawk walked back to Elena. She was staring at him with wide, shocked eyes. She had seen the speed. She had seen the strength. You really are a monster," she whispered. "Yes," Hawk said gently, unlocking her cuffs with a snap of his fingers that broke the steel mechanism. "But tonight, I'm your monster. Let's go home, Elena." They turned to leave, but the door blocked their path. Not the one they had broken, but the side entrance. It burst open. Sheriff Morrison, the chief of police and the judge's brother-in-law, stood there. Behind him were 10 SWAT officers in full tactical gear, assault rifles raised. "Nobody moves!" the sheriff screamed. "Drop to the ground! Now!" Judge Thorne stood up, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. "Sheriff, arrest them! They assaulted my son." Hawk sighed. He looked at Chains. "I tried to do it by the book," Hawk said. "You did," Chains agreed, closing his briefcase. "Now, I believe we move to the overwhelming force phase of the litigation." Hawk tapped his earpiece. "Silas," Hawk said, "bring the rain." Outside, the red flares went out, and 300 engines roared to life. The standoff in the courtroom lasted exactly 10 seconds. That was how long it took for Sheriff Morrison to realize that aiming an assault rifle at Aurelius Valerius was like aiming a slingshot at a hurricane. "Silas," Hawk had said, "bring the rain." The resulting sound wasn't gunfire. It was the sound of the courthouse's heavy oak doors, the ones blocking the main public entrance downstairs, being torn from their hinges. Then came the sound of 300 pairs of boots moving in perfect, terrifying unison up the marble stairs. It sounded like a landslide. Inside the courtroom, the laptop on the clerk's desk let out a sharp, piercing chime. "Sheriff Morrison," a voice boomed from the speakers. It was Justice Herrera, live via video link, her face filling the screen above the jury box. She looked furious. "If your men fire a single shot, I will have you indicted for federal conspiracy before the casing hits the floor." The sheriff froze, his finger trembling on the trigger. "I have watched this entire proceeding," Justice Herrera announced, her voice cutting through the panic. "I saw Judge Thorne deny due process. I saw Sterling Thorne attempt to murder a defense consultant. And I see you pointing weapons at unarmed civilians." "Unarmed?" Morrison sputtered, gesturing at Hawk. "He crushed a gun with his bare hand." "He disarmed an active shooter," Chains corrected smoothly. "A public service, really." "Stand down, Sheriff," Justice Herrera commanded. "Federal marshals are 2 minutes away. You are relieved of duty pending a full investigation." Morrison looked at the judge, who was slumped in his chair, defeated. He looked at Sterling, who was groaning on the floor. Then he looked at Hawk, whose eyes were still that swirling, abyssal black. The sheriff lowered his weapon. "We're done," he muttered to his SWAT team. Hawk turned to Elena. She was shaking, the adrenaline crash finally hitting her. "It's over," Hawk said, his voice returning to its human register. He offered her his arm. "Let's get you out of here." They walked out of the courtroom, leaving the chaos of the Thorne dynasty crumbling behind them. Chains stayed behind, already on his phone, coordinating with the incoming marshals to ensure the evidence, and the unconscious Sterling didn't disappear. When Hawk and Elena stepped out of the courthouse doors, the morning sun had fully risen. For a vampire, it should have been uncomfortable, but the sky was heavy with gray storm clouds, casting the world in a protective gloom. But it was what waited at the bottom of the steps that made Elena stop in her tracks. The parking lot and the street were empty of police. The local cops had retreated. In their place, the Covenant had formed a corridor. 300 vampires stood in 2 perfect lines, creating a path of black suits and silence that led straight to Hawk's armored car. They weren't wearing leather cuts or biker patches. They were dressed in the finery of the old world, tailored coats, silver pins, an elegance that felt out of time. Not a single engine was running, just silent respect for a girl who had found her voice against a monster. Celine, Maven, stepped forward first. She looked nothing like the grandmotherly figure from the biker story. She looked like a queen of the night. She held out a heavy, velvet-lined coat, smaller, fitted for a human, with the Covenant's sigil embroidered in silver thread on the inside. "The cold can be biting when you leave the cage," Celine said gently, draping the coat over Elena's shoulders, covering the orange jumpsuit and the cast on her arm. "Welcome to the family, child," Celine whispered. Elena looked at the sea of pale faces, at the dangerous men and women who had defied the sun to stand guard for her. Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't understand," she stammered, looking up at Hawk. "You don't even know me. Why did you do all this?" Victor, Diesel, stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the view of the news cameras that were still filming from the perimeter. "You are Gabrielle Rousseau's daughter," Victor rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "That makes you blood, and we protect blood." Hawk watched from a few steps back, his throat tight. This was why he led them. Not for the power, or the territory, or the immortality, but for this. For the moments when the oath meant something real, when a scared human learned she wasn't alone in the dark. "Ready to go home?" Hawk asked, opening the door of the Rolls-Royce. Elena looked back at the courthouse one last time. Somewhere inside, Judge Thorne was being handcuffed. Somewhere inside, the nightmare was ending. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Arizona for now," Hawk said. "My estate has a guest wing. It's yours as long as you need it. Chains is working on making the guardianship permanent, but that'll take time. We'll figure it out together. Your dad would have wanted you safe. That's all that matters." Elena nodded, wiping her eyes. "Uncle Hawk, thank you. For keeping your promise. For believing me when nobody else would. Always," he said simply. She climbed into the safety of the armored car. Hawk slid into the driver's seat. "All right, Covenant." Hawk's voice carried over the encrypted comms one last time. "Let's ride." 300 engines roared to life in perfect synchronization. It wasn't the jagged roar of motorcycles, but the deep, powerful purr of high-performance machines, a symphony of power that vibrated in the chest. They pulled out slowly, Hawk leading with Elena. The formation reformed around them, a protective escort that stretched half a mile down the highway. Victor and Celine flanked them. The rest filled in between. A wall of loyalty on wheels. People in the town came out of their houses to watch them pass. They didn't look with fear anymore. They looked with awe. They had seen the bullies fall. They had seen the king arrive. As they hit the open highway, leaving Arabella behind, Elena leaned back in the leather seat. She watched the desert blur past through the tinted glass. They had won. Not perfectly. The investigation into the other murders would take years. There would be therapy sessions and nightmares and difficult days ahead. But right now, in this moment, they had kept a promise. They had given one girl her life back. They had proved that family wasn't always who you were born to. Sometimes it was the monsters who adopted you. By the time they crossed the state line into Arizona, the storm clouds broke, and the first true rays of the sun hit the desert floor. In the rearview mirror, Hawk caught Elena's reflection. She was touching the silver embroidery on the coat Celine had given her, and for the first time in what might have been years, she was smiling. Behind them, the corrupt town disappeared into the distance. Behind them, a nightmare ended. Ahead, the highway stretched endless and full of possibility. The Sanguine Covenant rode into the light, 300 strong, carrying one girl towards a future she had almost forgotten existed.